I woke up at 3:47 in the morning because the woman I loved was whispering another man's name into the dark. And the worst part wasn't the name itself, it was how tender her voice sounded when she said it, soft and aching, the way you only speak to someone you're afraid of losing. I lay there completely still, my heart slamming against my ribs, listening to Ava breathe beside me, her hand curled loosely against my chest like it always was, like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just said Julian into my collarbone with more feeling than she'd said my name in weeks. Outside, the city hummed its usual 3-A.M. hum, a distant siren, a car passing wet pavement. Ordinary sounds that felt suddenly foreign against the strange, private ache sitting in my chest. I stared at the ceiling and did the math I always did on nights like this, counting how many times it had happened now, and I stopped somewhere around 11, because after 11 it starts to feel less like a coincidence and more like a truth you don't want to look at directly. I didn't wake her. I never did. I just lay there and let the silence eat at me. And somewhere in that silence, I made a decision I wasn't proud of, which was to keep pretending. For one more morning, that I hadn't heard anything at all. But to understand how a man ends up lying awake at 4 in the morning, competing with a ghost, you have to go back 9 months. To the night I first met Ava Whitfield, at a mutual friend's rooftop birthday party in early October, back when the string lights were still up and the air still smelled like the last warm night of the year. She was sitting alone at the edge of the roof with a paper cup of wine, looking at the skyline like it owed her money. And I remember thinking she had the kind of stillness that made a room feel quieter just by her being in it. I sat down next to her without asking and said something forgettable about the view, and she looked at me for a long moment before she said, "You're going to have to try harder than that." And I laughed. And that was it. That was the whole beginning. For words and a look that told me she'd already decided whether I was worth her time. We talked until the party thinned out around us. She told me she worked at a flower shop downtown, the kind with a bell on the door and a cat that slept in the window, and I told her I was an ER nurse. And she said that explained why I looked like I hadn't slept properly in 3 years, and I said that was fair. By the time the sun started threatening the edge of the sky, we'd exchanged numbers. And I remember walking home that morning feeling like I'd been handed something rare and hadn't quite figured out what to do with my hands yet. We fell into each other slowly, the way people do when they've both been burned before and are trying to be careful with something they don't want to break. She was funny in a dry, understated way that caught you off guard. She remembered small details about people's lives that most of us forget. She cried at dog food commercials and pretended she hadn't. And she loved fiercely when she let you in. The kind of love that showed up in small acts. In the coffee she'd have waiting for my night shifts. In the way she'd learned my schedule better than I had. She had a habit of humming while she arranged flowers at the shop. Something I discovered the first time I surprised her there on my day off. Standing in the doorway watching her twist stems into shape with a concentration that made the rest of the world disappear around her. She caught me watching and rolled her eyes, but she was smiling when she did it. And she tucked a single white ranunculus behind my ear just to make me look ridiculous. And I let her, because being made a fool of by Ava Whitfield turned out to be one of my favorite things in the world. 2 months in, I told her I was falling for her. Standing in her kitchen while she stirred a pot of soot, something that was burning slightly because she'd stopped paying attention to it, and she went quiet for a second too long before she said it back. And I told myself that pause meant nothing, that some people just needed an extra breath before the truth came out. I didn't know yet that the pause was actually the whole story, if only I'd known to listen for it. There were other small signs too, if I'm honest with myself now. Moments I filed away without examining too closely at the time. She never liked driving in the rain, and she'd go quiet in the passenger seat whenever it started, gripping the door handle like she was bracing for something. She kept her phone ringer on even at night, which struck me as odd for someone who otherwise guarded her privacy fiercely, and she never fully explained why. I noticed these things the way you notice a crack in a wall, small enough to walk past, easy to tell yourself you'll deal with later. The first time I heard the name, we'd been together about 5 months. And we'd just moved in together into a small 2-bedroom apartment near the hospital, the kind of place with creaky floors and a window unit that rattled all summer. It was our 3rd night in the new place, boxers still stacked against the walls, and I woke up to her murmuring something in her sleep, restless, her hand gripping my forearm hard enough to leave marks. I leaned in to hear her better, thinking she was having a nightmare, and I caught it clearly, one word, breathed out like a plea. Julian. I lay frozen, telling myself it meant nothing. That dreams are strange and lawless places. That people say all kinds of things in their sleep that have no bearing on waking life. I didn't ask her about it the next morning. I told myself it wasn't worth the awkwardness over something she probably wouldn't even remember. It happened again 3 weeks later, and then again after that. Not every night, not even every week, but often enough that I started noticing a pattern. That it seemed to happen most on nights when she'd had a hard day at the shop, or when we'd had a small disagreement before bed, or on dates that meant something to her that she never explained to me. The 14th of March, the 2nd of August, dates she'd go quiet around without saying why. I started keeping a mental tally without meaning to, the way you count something you're afraid to say out loud. And every time it happened, I told myself the same thing, that I wouldn't ask, that some things were better left as dreams. But dreams don't usually come with that much tenderness in the voice. Dreams don't usually make your girlfriend's whole body soften like she's being held by someone who isn't there. 6 months in, I finally worked up the nerve to say something, not accusatory, just gentle. Over pancakes on a lazy Sunday morning with the sun coming in sideways through the blinds, I asked her, as carefully as I knew how, who Julian was. Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. She set it down slowly, like she was buying herself time, and she said, "Where did you hear that name?" in a voice that had gone very flat, very controlled. The kind of controlled that tells you someone is working hard not to fall apart. I told her the truth, that she said it in her sleep sometimes, and I watched something close behind her eyes. A door swinging shut. "He's nobody," she said. "He's someone from a long time ago." And she got up and started clearing plates that weren't finished yet. And I understood, even then, that I had touched something with teeth, and that pushing further that morning would cost me more than I was ready to pay. A few weeks after that Sunday morning, we went to a dinner party at her friend Priya's apartment. A loud, warm gathering of people who'd known Ava for years, long before I existed in her life, full of inside jokes and old stories I could only half follow. I was rinsing glasses in the kitchen when I overheard two of her old friends talking in low voices by the window, not realizing I could hear them over the music. One of them said something about how good it was to see Ava smiling again, and the other said, quieter, "Yeah, but you know she still has that box, right? I don't think she's ever really let go of Julian." And then they noticed me standing there and the conversation died instantly, replaced by too bright small talk about the weather. I didn't say anything to Ava that night, but I carried those words home with me like a stone in my pocket, heavy in a way that made every step afterward feel a little more deliberate, a little more aware of its own weight. That night, lying beside her in the dark, I found myself doing something I wasn't proud of. I started searching, quietly, carefully, for whatever it was Priya's friends had been talking about. I told myself I wasn't snooping, that I was just trying to understand. But there's no honest word for going through someone's things while they sleep beside you, trusting you completely. I didn't find the shoebox that night. I found something smaller and somehow worse. A folded receipt tucked into the back pocket of a jacket she never wore anymore. Dated 3 years earlier, for a florist delivery to a hospital room, and beneath the item description, in her own handwriting, the words for Jay, "Get well soon, love always." I put it back exactly where I found it, and I lay awake until morning with a question I didn't know how to ask without admitting what I'd done to find it. I let it go for a while after that. The way you let go of a splinter you can't quite dig out, telling yourself it'll work its way to the surface eventually. Life moved forward around the silence. We adopted a scruffy orange cat from the shelter and named him Biscuit because Ava said he looked like he'd been rolled in flour. We had a good stretch, months where I almost forgot about the name entirely, where her laugh came easy and her hands found mine without hesitation, where I let myself believe that whoever Julian was, he'd been reduced to nothing more than an old scar, the kind that doesn't hurt anymore, it just remembers. That illusion cracked one night in late January, during the worst storm we'd had all winter, when I was pulling a night shift in the ER, and a call came in about a multi-car collision on the wet highway a few miles from our apartment. I didn't think much of it until I glanced at the intake board and saw the intersection listed, 2 streets over from the flower shop, close enough that my stomach dropped before I even understood why. I texted Ava on my break, just a quick check-in, nothing that would alarm her, and she didn't respond for almost 40 minutes, which was unlike her. When she finally called me back, her voice was thin and far away, and she admitted she'd pulled her car over on the shoulder of the road because her hands were shaking too badly to keep driving, that the sound of the rain on the windshield had dropped her straight back into a phone call from 3 years ago, and that she'd sat there in the dark for half an hour before she trusted herself to move again. I left work early that night, something I never did, and drove out to sit with her in her stalled car until the shaking stopped. And neither of us said much, because there wasn't much that needed saying. Only the rain on the roof, and her hand gripping mine like it was the only solid thing left in the world. I didn't bring up Julian's name that night, and neither did she. But I understood then that grief like hers didn't live only in her sleep. It lived in weather, in intersections, in the particular sound of tires on a wet road. And that the version of her I saw during the day, steady and composed, was a version she had built carefully on top of something that could still buckle without warning. I started paying closer attention after that. Not out of suspicion anymore, but out of something closer to vigilance. The way you watch over someone you love who is carrying more than they let on. And then something I wasn't ready for happened, on an ordinary Tuesday in February, when I came home early from a shift that got canceled, and found her sitting on the floor of our closet with a shoebox open in her lap, tears streaming silently down her face, holding a folded piece of paper like it was made of glass. She didn't hear me come in. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her, feeling like I was intruding on something sacred and terrible at the same time. And when she finally noticed me, she scrambled to close the box. But not fast enough, because I'd already seen what was inside. A man's watch, a ticket stub, a handful of photographs of Ava, younger and lighter, laughing next to a tall guy with dark curly hair and a crooked smile, a folded letter with handwriting that wasn't hers. "Ava," I said quietly, and she just shook her head, pressing the box shut like she could seal the whole conversation away with it. And I crouched down in front of her and asked, as gently as I could manage with my pulse hammering in my throat, "Please tell me who he is." And for the first time in 6 months, she looked at me like she was finally deciding whether I'd earned the truth. She told me that Julian had been her fiancé, that they'd been together for years, that they were supposed to get married the following spring, and that 3 years ago, on a rainy November night, he'd been driving to pick her up from a work event because her car had broken down, and he never made it, because another driver ran a red light and hit him at an intersection 2 blocks from the flower shop. She said the last thing she'd said to him on the phone was that she was running late and he shouldn't rush. And she said those words like they were a confession she'd been carrying alone for 3 years. Like somehow her lateness had put him on that road at that exact moment. Like she'd built herself a cage out of a sentence she couldn't take back. I sat on that closet floor with her for almost an hour, not saying much, just holding her while she cried in a way I'd never seen her cry before. And when she finally quieted, she said, "I'm sorry, I never told you. I didn't know how to say it without it becoming the only thing you saw when you looked at me." She told me about the receipt too, before I even had to admit I'd seen it, because guilt has a way of surfacing on its own if you give it enough room. Julian had been sick once, early in their relationship, a bad case of pneumonia that put him in the hospital for a week, and she'd send flowers every single day because she didn't know what else to do with the fear of almost losing him before she'd even learned how to keep him. "I kept everything," she admitted, voice raw, every receipt, every card, every stupid grocery list in his handwriting, because I was terrified that if I threw any of it away, I'd start forgetting the sound of his voice, and forgetting felt like losing him twice. I told her I understood, and in that moment I believed I did. But understanding grief and living inside its shadow are two very different things. And I learned that difference slowly, painfully, over the months that followed. Knowing the name now didn't make it easier to hear in the dark. If anything, it made it worse. Because now, the name had a face, a story, a whole life I could never compete with, a man frozen forever at 20, who would never say the wrong thing at dinner, or leave his socks on the floor, or grow old and gray and imperfect the way I would. Ghosts don't age. Ghosts don't disappoint you. I started noticing things I hadn't let myself notice before. How she still wore a small silver ring on a chain tucked under her shirt. How she flinched slightly every November. How there was a version of her I would never get to meet, because he'd gotten there first and taken it with him. I told myself I was being unfair to a dead man and unfair to the woman I loved. And most days I believed that and pushed the feeling down. But it kept surfacing anyway, in small, ugly moments I wasn't proud of. Like the time I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror comparing my jaw to the one in the photographs I'd seen. Or the night I asked her, more sharply than I meant to, if she'd ever really stopped comparing me to him, and watched her face crumple like I'd struck her. "That's not fair," she said, voice shaking. "I'm not comparing you to anyone. I'm just trying to survive something you'll never understand." And I said something I regretted the second it left my mouth. Something like, "Maybe I'd understand it better if you actually let me in instead of grieving him in your sleep and shutting me out during the day." The silence after that sentence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard in that apartment. She didn't say anything, neither did I. We just stood there, 2 feet apart, further away from each other than we'd ever been. She slept in the guest room that night, and I lay alone in the bed we shared, staring at the ceiling, feeling like I'd taken something fragile and precious and thrown it against a wall just to see if it would survive. And some small, cruel part of me almost wanted it not to, because at least then the waiting would be over. I didn't sleep. Around 5 in the morning, I got up and made coffee. I didn't drink. And when Ava emerged from the guest room with red-rimmed eyes and her arms wrapped around herself like she was cold in a warm apartment, I said the only true thing I had left, which was that I was sorry. That grief wasn't a competition, and I had no right to treat it like one. That I loved her, and I was scared. And being scared had made me cruel. And cruel was never who I wanted to be with her. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Somewhere between exhaustion and the smallest flicker of hope. And then she said 4 words that would end up changing everything that came after. "I need to show you something." She led me to the closet, pulled out the same shoebox, and this time she didn't close it against me. She opened it all the way and laid everything out on the bed like she was finally ready to stop hiding the evidence of a life I hadn't been allowed to see. The watch had stopped at the exact time of the accident. She told me she'd never had the heart to change the battery. The letter was one Julian had written her on their 2nd anniversary, full of plans for a future that never came. A house with a yellow door, 3 kids, a dog named after a jazz musician. She told me things she'd never said out loud to anyone, not even her therapist. That some nights she dreamed she was back on that phone call. That she dreamed she told him to hurry instead of telling him to be careful. That she'd rewritten that conversation in her sleep 1,000 times, trying to find the version where he lived. And that maybe that was why his name came out of her mouth at night. Not because some part of her loved him more than she loved me, but because some part of her was still down on that road with him, still trying to change the ending. Still 4 years old in her grief no matter how many years actually passed. I held her while she said all of this, and something in me finally understood what I'd been too afraid or too proud to understand before. That I wasn't competing with Julian at all, that there was no competition to lose. Because he wasn't a rival, he was a wound. And wounds don't need to be defeated, they need to be tended. I told her I didn't need her to stop loving him to prove she loved me, that both things could live in her at once, that I'd rather stand beside her grief than ask her to bury it somewhere I couldn't see. And she cried again. But it was a different kind of crying this time, the kind that comes after you've set something down you've been carrying too long. We stayed up until the sun came in fully through the blinds, and for the first time since I'd found that shoebox, I felt like we were actually on the same side of something instead of standing across a gap. Neither of us knew how to close. Things didn't fix themselves overnight, because grief doesn't work that way, and neither does trust once it's been shaken. But something shifted after that morning. A door had opened that had been locked for 3 years, and slowly, carefully, she started letting me walk through it with her. She told me about the funeral, about how she couldn't cry that day because she was too busy being strong for his mother, about how she'd gone back to work at the flower shop 2 weeks later because staying home meant staring at a ring she'd never gotten to wear, about how she used to set a second cup of coffee out of habit for almost a year afterward before she trained herself to stop. I started asking about him, not out of jealousy but out of genuine care, what made him laugh, what his favorite song was, and I watched something in her Lucine every time she got to talk about him without feeling like it would cost her something, without feeling like grief and love for me had to be enemies. Spring came, and with it, the anniversary of the accident, the 14th of March, the date I now understood she'd been going quiet around for as long as I'd known her. I didn't try to distract her from it, or fix it, or make it smaller than it was. I just asked her what she needed, and she said she wanted to visit the spot, something she hadn't done in 2 years because she couldn't face it alone. I drove her there in the early morning, and we stood together at that ordinary intersection that held the weight of the worst night of her life. And she set down a small bundle of white ranunculus, his favorite flower, she told me, from her own shop. And she said something to the empty street that I didn't fully catch and didn't ask her to repeat, because some words are for the dead and not for the living to overhear. When she turned back to me, her eyes were wet, but her face was calmer than I'd ever seen it on that date before. And she took my hand and said, "Thank you for not making me do that alone." And I understood that I hadn't fixed her, because there was nothing broken that needed fixing. I had simply been allowed, finally, to stand where she stood. She started seeing a grief counselor that spring too, something she'd resisted for years because she said, talking about Julian to a stranger felt like betraying him somehow, like reducing 4 years of love into a 50-minute appointment. I never pushed her toward it, I only told her I'd support whatever she needed. And one evening she came home from her 3rd session and told me, almost shyly, that her counselor had said something that finally made sense to her, that love doesn't move in a straight line from one person to the next. It accumulates, it makes room for itself, and that healing wasn't about loving Julian less. It was about discovering she still had more love left to give than she'd ever believed possible after losing him. She told me that in our kitchen, leaning against the counter with biscuit weaving figure 8s around her ankles, and I remember thinking that whatever fear I'd carried in those early months, about being some permanent runner-up in her heart, had quietly dissolved somewhere in the months of standing beside her instead of asking her to hurry past what still hurt. The nightmares didn't stop completely, not for a while. And some nights I'd still wake to a whispered name in the dark, but something about it felt different now, lighter somehow, less like a secret I'd stumbled onto and more like a language I'd been let in on. I stopped counting. I stopped lying awake doing arithmetic with a dead man's syllables. Instead, on the nights it happened, I'd just hold her a little tighter, and sometimes she'd stir and say my name right after, like her sleeping mind was checking to make sure I was still there, still real, still choosing to stay. There was one night in early May, months after that morning in the closet, when I woke to her crying softly in her sleep, deep and shaken, and I gathered her into my arms and murmured her name until her eyes fluttered open, disoriented and scared, and she looked at me for a long moment in the dark, taking in my face like she was surfacing from somewhere very far away. And instead of saying his name like I half expected, she said mine, clear and certain, Noah, like it was the only word she had, like she was choosing it on purpose, even in the fog of half sleep. I didn't say anything right away. I just held her while her breathing evened out, my heart doing something complicated and enormous in my chest, because I understood exactly what that one small word meant, even if she didn't fully realize she'd said it. It wasn't that Julian had disappeared, and it wasn't that I expected him to. Grief like hers doesn't have an expiration date, and I'd stopped wanting it to. But somewhere in those months of standing beside her instead of asking her to move past something that couldn't be moved past, I had become someone her heart reached for, even in its most unguarded, undefended moments. In the place where the truth lives before the mind has time to arrange it into something presentable. In the morning, I told her what had happened, carefully, watching her face for any flicker of the old flinch, and instead she just went very still. And then she smiled, a real smile, slow and a little disbelieving, like she was hearing good news about herself for the first time in years. I said your name, she repeated, like she was testing the shape of the sentence, and I said, "You did?" And she reached over and took my hand across the kitchen table. And neither of us said much else, because some moments don't need decoration. They just need to be allowed to exist. I proposed to her 3 weeks later, not with any elaborate plan, just on an ordinary Thursday evening in the flower shop after closing, surrounded by buckets of tulips and the particular green smell of stems freshly cut. She was sweeping the floor and complaining about a delivery that had come in wilted when I asked her to stop for a second. And when she turned around, I was already on one knee, no ring box. Just my grandmother's ring warm in my closed fist because I'd been carrying it around in my pocket for a week trying to find the right moment, and had finally decided there was no such thing. There was only the moment you were brave enough to take. She dropped the broom. She didn't answer right away. She just pressed both hands over her mouth and nodded, over and over, until she finally managed to say yes. And the cat that lived in the shop window jumped down and wound around both our ankles like even he understood something important was happening. We got married the following autumn, a small ceremony in her mother's backyard with string lights that reminded me of the rooftop where we'd met. And I stood at the end of the aisle watching her walk toward me in a dress the color of early morning. And I thought about the shoebox in our closet, which we'd kept, because I never asked her to get rid of it. Some things you don't erase, you just make room for them alongside everything new. Julian's mother came to the wedding, something Ava had asked for nervously, unsure if it would be too strange or too painful for either of them. But the older woman had hugged me tightly at the reception and said, with tears standing in her eyes, that her son would have wanted exactly this for Ava. A house full of noise and flowers and a man who didn't flinch from her grief. And that watching her laugh again that night felt like a gift she hadn't expected to receive. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just thanked her, and held on to the moment the way you hold on to something you know you'll want to remember for the rest of your life. During the vows, I told her that I hadn't fallen in love with a version of her that had never known loss. I'd fallen in love with the whole of her, including the parts that still ached, and that I didn't need her heart to be a clean slate. I only needed it to have room for me too, and it did. More room than I think either of us had believed possible on that first hard night in the closet. If you've ever loved someone who is still carrying a grief you couldn't see the edges of, you'll understand exactly what I mean when I say that love isn't about erasing what came before you. It's about being willing to stand in it with them until the weight becomes something they can finally set down on their own terms. These days, Biscuit is older and lazier, sprawled across the foot of our bed most nights, and Ava still sometimes talks in her sleep, though it happens less now, and when it does, it's just as likely to be my name as anyone else's. Or sometimes something ordinary and unromantic, like reminding a customer their tulips need water. She expanded the flower shop last spring, knocked through the wall to the empty unit next door, and hung a small hand-painted sign by the register that says nothing needs to be forgotten to be moved past. Something her grief counselor once told her that she liked enough to make permanent. I still work night shifts at the hospital, and she still leaves coffee waiting for me some mornings. Though now there are 2 cups. Because some habits, once you understand where they come from, are worth keeping rather than breaking. Every November 14th, we still drive out to that intersection together. And every year the flowers she sets down feel a little less like grief and a little more like gratitude. For the years she had with him and, she's told me, for the years she still gets to have because of the way he taught her to love fully, even knowing it might cost her everything. I used to think I was competing with a ghost in that apartment, lying awake counting whispered syllables like evidence against myself, but I learned that the opposite of jealousy isn't indifference. It's patience, and patience, it turns out, is just love that's willing to wait for the truth to surface in its own time. She woke up one night and said my name instead of his, and it wasn't the ending of anything. It was the beginning of understanding that a heart can hold more than one kind of love at once, and that the name someone says in the dark isn't nearly as important as the person they choose to build a life with in the daylight.